Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're zoning in on just one source, actually. A really thought-provoking one.
Yeah, it tackles something pretty perplexing about, well, us, humans, especially around leadership.
Exactly. The question is, why do people sometimes keep celebrating or, stay attached to leaders who've pretty clearly failed?
Right. The source brings us up specifically thinking about Nigeria, but honestly, you see this pattern all over.
You really do. And
Yeah.
it makes you wonder, what's driving that loyalty? So, our source mentions Professor Wole Soyinka was asked this exact thing recently.
And his response, according to this report, it was pretty stunning.
Yeah, stunning is the word. What did the source say he actually replied?
He reportedly said that many people have, quote, slavery encoded in their DNA.
Wow. Okay, that's intense. Just hearing it.
And he didn't stop there, apparently. The source also quotes him saying something just as provocative.
Which was?
That for a lot of Africans, their freedom lives in their enslavement.
Freedom is an enslavement. Okay.
Yeah. And the report adds, maybe unsurprisingly, that these comments stunned the audience.
I can imagine. It's a deeply, deeply challenging thing to say.
For sure.
So, look, for this deep dive, let's be clear. We're not here to debate biology or the literal truth of DNA encoding slavery.
No, not at all. And we're not agreeing or disagreeing with the professor's view overall.
Right. Our job, just sticking to what the source reports, is to try and unpack the idea. What could it mean to say slavery is encoded in DNA or freedom lives in enslavement as an explanation for why people stick with failed leaders?
Okay, so if we focus just on that reported context, sticking with failed leaders, the phrasing sounds, well, metaphorical, right? Not literal genetics.
Okay, a metaphor. So slavery encoded in DNA might be
What?
a really strong way to describe something else.
Exactly. Maybe a powerful, maybe even, hyperbolic way to talk about a psychological predisposition. Or perhaps a societal pattern that's so deeply ingrained, maybe through history or culture, that it feels almost automatic, innate, even if it isn't literally genetic.
Okay. So less biology, more about profound conditioning, like a learned behavior that gets passed down somehow.
That seems to be the angle based on the context.
And how does that connect to the second part then? Freedom lives in their enslavement. How would that explain celebrating failure?
Well, that phrase seems key, doesn't it? If we take the source's framing, it suggests a state where freedom isn't. Well, that's not what we usually think of. Not autonomy.
Not self-determination.
Right. Instead, maybe freedom is found or felt as a kind of comfort or security, but found within a structure of dependency. Even if that structure involves being, let's say, subjugated or poorly led. So the enslavement part of the quote could represent that familiar feeling of being led, of giving up some responsibility.
Okay. So celebrating a leader who's failed might not actually be about liking the results.
Perhaps not.
But maybe it's more like a subconscious thing. Preferring the known situation, the existing hierarchy, even if it's bad, because changing things feels risky or too much work. A kind of comfort in being dependent.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. Drawing just from the reported comments in the source, it suggests the psychological effort of real freedom. Demanding agency, taking responsibility, challenging things that might feel heavier somehow, more threatening perhaps.
Heavier than just sticking with what you know, even if what you know is failure.
Exactly. So the freedom is found inside the limits of being led, because stepping outside that feels too uncertain, too demanding.
It really makes you think beyond the usual explanations, like people just not knowing better or economic problems forcing their hand.
It does. It points towards a possible internal conflict, doesn't it? Where the comfort of the familiar, flawed as it is, wins out over the maybe scary demands of real independence.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting, just looking at the source's account, is this idea that maybe historical patterns of dependency or subjugation can get internalized really deeply.
To the point where it actually shapes how people even define freedom.
Well, potentially. And how they relate to authority. It could make people, maybe collectively, resistant to breaking cycles, even obviously bad ones.
Okay, so let's try and sum up this really challenging idea we got from the source. Professor Wole Soyinka reportedly suggested that sticking with failed leaders might come from a deep psychological pattern.
Described very starkly as slavery encoded in their DNA.
Where people somehow find a kind of freedom, maybe a comfort, paradoxically, within that state of dependency or being led.
Freedom lives in their enslavement.
Preferring that known state to the demands of true autonomy.
And again, it's so important to stress. This is one perspective reported in our source, offered by Professor Soyinka in response to a specific question. We're just exploring the idea as presented.
Absolutely. But wow, it's a stark idea. Uncomfortable, even. But it definitely forces you to confront some possibly deep-seated things about human behavior, about our relationship with authority, with freedom.
It really does. And it leaves you, the listener, with something to think about, doesn't it? This assertion that for some, freedom lives in their enslavement. What does that make you think about patterns you see in society? Or maybe even, that feeling of collective inertia sometimes.
Right.
Resistance to change.
Yeah. It's definitely a challenging lens to look through, a lot to mull over.